It's that time again. A major international football tournament, and that can only mean one thing. No, not that Scotland aren't there. They were at the Euros, so that joke doesn't even work anymore. I am referring, of course, to the return of my What If Every National Team Could Bring Back a Legends series. The concept, in case it wasn't already obvious, is to take a look at the squad and most likely starting 11 of every team at this World Cup, and then to pick out one legend from their past that would improve them the most. So it takes into account where a team looks strongest, where their weaknesses might be, and, quite literally, every player to have ever represented them. And that is why I like it. Sometimes it will just be the country's GOAT, unavoidably, but not always, since it won't always be the best individual that provides the best solutions to a team's current problems. I know, right? Merging all of the nuances of every World Cup squad with the totality of their past and their stars of yesteryear. What's not to like? That's why I made this video before the 2018 World Cup and Euro 2020, and it is surprising just how much the solutions and players change within the space of just a couple of years. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't do it again, since that would be a bit tedious. Right. Without further ado then, neither of whom are my choices for either England or the USA, I regret to inform you, here is the player that I would pick if every World Cup team could bring back just one legend at the absolute peak of their powers to add to their current squads. Argentina, Diego Maradona. Going in alphabetical order, I spent ages umming and ahhing, drawing up alternative 11s and comparing them for Argentina, before picking the most obvious and predictable answer in this entire video. What a chronic waste of time. My dilemma was that, despite being one of the favourites to win this World Cup, justifiably I think, Argentina do actually have several areas in which they could be strengthened. Prime Javier Zanetti would be a substantive upgrade on Nahuel Molina at right back. Someone like Daniel Passarella slotting in alongside Cristian Romero at centre-back would be a great improvement over a 34-year-old Nicolas Otamendi. Meanwhile, you could also replace Leandro Paredes, for example, in defensive or holding midfield with two of the greatest players ever to have played in that position, namely Luis Monti and Fernando Redondo. I think that it will be Paredes and Rodrigo de Paul who start for Argentina in midfield, plus one other, most likely Alejandro Gomez at this stage, and it is that third midfield spot, instead of Gomez, that I think Argentina could strengthen the most, with either Alfredo Di Stefano or Diego Armando Maradona, two of the four greatest players ever to have played the sport, as far as I'm concerned. In the end, I went with Maradona, given that his peak was arguably the greatest in the entire history of the sport, and I think that his star power would be the most likely to win Argentina this World Cup. After all, he's done it once before. Australia, Harry Kewell. Another really difficult one. I did myself dirty a bit in terms of this start by going in alphabetical order, rather than group by group, and I must be honest in saying that I don't think this Australia squad is a strong one. There is no area of the pitch where a former great couldn't improve them tenfold, not even in goal, given Matt Ryan's form over the last couple of years. Up front, I'm not even sure who'll start for Australia, either Jamie McLaren or Martin Boyle I'd imagine, so Mark Viduka would be a major improvement there, as would replacing Ashton Hrustic with a prime Tim Cahill. Given that it could really be any of them though, the greatest peak ever attained by an Australian footballer was Harry Kewell at the turn of the millennium, when he was one of the best wide players on the planet, so for his sheer star power and ability to win games on his own in a fairly mediocre Socceroos team, he's my pick. Belgium, Vincent Kompany. Despite being ranked second in the world still, and being the favourites to win their group, there are some real problem areas for Belgium heading into this World Cup. Alexis Salamakers has been ruled out of the tournament through injury, Eden Hazard has played barely 200 minutes of football for Real Madrid so far this season, and Roberto Martinez has stated that Romelu Lukaku will only be picked if he is fit, which, quite frankly, he doesn't appear to be at the moment. If Lukaku is seriously unfit, then you could make a case for Paul van Himpst, But ultimately, Belgium's centre-backs, namely Toby Alderweireld and Jan Vertonghen, have a combined age of 68. And though only recently retired, a prime Vincent Kompany was one of the best centre-backs in Europe, so I think that he would make the biggest difference out of anyone to Roberto Martinez's team. Brazil. Pelé. Brazil are the most successful team in the history of the World Cup. They have had more great players than any other country, and they are the favourites to win the tournament for a sixth time in 2022. And yet, this one seemed oddly straightforward. You could make a case for upgrading either of Brazil's fullbacks, given that it has historically been such a strong position for them, but is now a rare weakness, by swapping Danilo for Carlos Alberto Torres at right back, or Alexandro Finilton Santos at left back, for example. Both would be massive upgrades, but it is at centre forward, where Chiche will most likely start Richarlison at the World Cup, that you could really transform this Brazil team overnight. Any one of Ronaldo, Romario or Pelé would turn this Brazil team into almost odds-on favourites to win the World Cup, and it is practically impossible to look beyond Pelé, Brazil's greatest ever player, arguably the world's greatest ever player, and the only man to have won 3 World Cups. That is despite the fact that Pelé never got the chance to star in a World Cup during his prime, injured in 62 and 66, so I am giving him that opportunity in Qatar since, I'm nice like that. Cameroon. Samuel Eto'o. Cameroon is another difficult one because their greatest players are Samuel Eto'o and Roger Milla, but they are probably strongest at this moment in time in the forward areas, with the likes of Vincent Aboubakar, Karl Toko Ekambi, and Eric Maxim Choupo-Moting. Then you think of someone like Thomas Nkono, but in goal is probably Cameroon's second strongest position, given the presence of Andre Onana. Current Cameroon boss Rigobert Song is one option at centre-back, but ultimately, my reasons for picking Samuel Eto'o are twofold. Not only is Eto'o Cameroon's greatest player of all time, and by some distance, he's also currently the president of the Cameroonian Football Federation, and a controversial president at that. Eto'o recently slammed the Cameroon squad, despite them having overachieved in even qualifying for this World Cup, and poured pressure onto them by demanding that they at least reach the final. So I would pick Eto'o, not only for his talent, in a position where Cameroon do have some decent, albeit far less talented options than him, but also because it would mean he couldn't be president of the Football Federation anymore, which might be even more of a benefit. Canada. Julian de Guzman. It's difficult to know how to put this, but to be totally honest, Canada haven't had many very good footballers. That is reflected in the fact that this is only Canada's second ever appearance at the World Cup, and they lost all 3 games without scoring a single goal in their only previous appearance in 1986. This is by far the best team that Canada have ever had, and they do genuinely have some very good players. I wish that I could pick Owen Hargreaves, who was born in Alberta, and would be a dream addition to Canada's current team, but he chose to represent England instead. Also on that note, whilst Hargreaves did at least go on to win 42 caps for England, I do wonder whether Fikayo Tomori might just be regretting his decision to represent England instead of Canada right now, given that he would undoubtedly be a starman for the Canucks. Anyway, my pick is Julian de Guzman, who only recently retired in 2016 and was bitterly unfortunate to miss out on this golden generation. A gifted and well-rounded midfielder who had great energy, de Guzman starred in both La Liga and the Bundesliga, as well as winning 89 caps for Canada. And whilst there isn't a great deal of competition, I do think that he would be a valuable addition to their current squad, and indeed their starting 11. Costa Rica. Alejandro Moreira. The dark horses of the 2014 World Cup in Brazil, Costa Rica were significantly less impressive in Russia, and they have been handed a horrible group in Qatar, up against Spain, Germany, and Japan. Most of Costa Rica's all-time greats have been forwards, and given that is where they are weakest right now, with Anthony Contreras likely to start them through the middle, that is where I turned my attention. Hernan Medford, Errol Daniels, and Paulo Wanchop all earn honourable mentions, but Alejandro Moreira is Costa Rica's GOAT, and his goals would give them a real chance even in a nightmare group. Moreira scored 63 goals in 76 games for FC Barcelona during the mid-1930s, in addition to scoring 6 from only 7 appearances for Costa Rica, so the 5'5" magician would stroll into their starting 11. Croatia. Stepan Bobek. Croatia have always produced great wide players, even going back to their days as part of Yugoslavia, and they currently have an abundance of outstanding midfielders, including Marcelo Brozovic, Mateo Kovacic, and Luka Modric, who one would imagine would be the 3 that start for them. One area where Croatia have struggled, in some ways ever since Mario Mandzukic's international retirement, is in terms of an out-and-out centre-forward, where despite Marko Livaja's incredible goal-scoring record for Hajduk Split, he has so far managed only 3 goals from 14 caps for Croatia. That makes Stepan Bobek the obvious choice, and the right choice I think, as well as being, off the top of my head, the first duplicate inclusion from my video on if ever a Euro 2020 team could bring back a legend as well. Bobek scored 122 goals in 202 games for Partizan Belgrade and 36 in 63 for the Yugoslavia national team. As a remarkably gifted and intelligent second striker, or number 10, so he takes this one narrowly ahead of Davor Šuka. Denmark. Michael Laudrup. Only a fool would write Denmark off going into this World Cup, given that their star man is someone who has quite literally risen from the dead, and they are in fine form going into this World Cup. A clear weakness, though, is up front, where one would expect Kasper Dolberg to start, despite the fact that he has failed to find the back of the net so far this season, during his 8 appearances on loan at Sevilla. Preben Elkjær is probably Denmark's greatest out-and-out centre-forward, meanwhile Juventus great, Karl Øge Hansen, scored 17 goals from just 22 caps as an inside forward, but I'm afraid that I couldn't resist being really boring again and picking Michael Laudrup. Denmark's midfield is packed full of industry with Pierre-Emil Højbjerg and Thomas Delaney, plus the invention of Christian Eriksen. And even if you had to play Laudrup as a false 9, he was so good at his best, one of the most gifted Europeans ever to have played the game, that I think he would bring more dynamism and star power to the party than just about anyone else. Even if he did bail on them in 1992, only to end up missing out on winning the Euros, the silly sausage. Ecuador. Alberto Spencer. The easiest decision in this entire video, I think. Ecuador are a good team, but they lack a really lethal centre-forward, with Michael Estrada and Enner Valencia likely to be their front 2 at the World Cup, and their greatest ever player, by an order of many magnitudes, happens to be an incredibly prolific centre-forward. Alberto Spencer is not only Ecuador's greatest ever player, but arguably one of South America's, and he still holds the record for having scored the most goals in the history of the Copa Libertadores. Spencer scored 446 goals in 662 games at club level, in addition to representing both Ecuador and Uruguay at international level, and he would turn Ecuador into huge favourites to progress from Group A, even if only as runners-up. It should be said, Enner Valencia has a great goal-scoring record for Ecuador and is in outstanding form for Fenerbahce this season, but Alberto Spencer, he most certainly is not. England. Neil Franklin. England's weakest position is centre-back, and the Three Lions have had many great ones over the years. Bobby Moore, Emlyn Hughes and Stan Cullis all spring to mind, and more recently so do the likes of Sol Campbell, Rio Ferdinand and John Terry. Any would waltz straight into this current England team, but my choice is Neil Franklin, and not just because I have written a book about him. Franklin was undoubtedly England's most complete centre-back, strong, intelligent, and technically outstanding, and the fact that you could play him in a 3 or in a 5 as a sweeper, or even in defence midfield, convinced me that he would be the most beneficial addition. France. Zinedine Zidane. The France squad is one that is packed full of talent, but there's still every chance that Adrien Rabiot could start for them in midfield, so it is that spot, most likely in alongside Aurelien Tchouameni and Youssouf Fofana, and playing behind Griezmann, Mbappe and Benzema, that I felt was most ripe for replacement. Jean Tigana was one option, as was Michel Platini, who I think is France's greatest ever player. Ultimately though, Zinedine Zidane gives you the best mixture of attack and defence out of the three. He was one of the greatest players of all time in transition, and he is a proven World Cup winner, so in he comes. Germany. Gerd Müller. I'm not going to call Germany dark horses at this World Cup, as I recently saw them described, which is a ludicrous suggestion when talking about the second most successful team in the history of the competition, but I do feel as though they might be a little bit underrated. Especially strong through their spine, Germany could certainly be strengthened at fullback by the likes of Paul Breitner or Philipp Lahm for example, but it is up front, where I expect Kai Havertz to be deployed as a false nine, that the greatest improvement could be made. Germany have had many great strikers, but none greater than Gerd Müller, who scored an incredible 68 goals from 62 games for West Germany, and is one of the best to have ever played the game. So I would bring Müller back, who sadly died in 2021, and I think he was so good that he would make this Germany team the favourites to win the World Cup. Ghana. Michael Essien. Abedi Pele and Ose Kofi are Ghana's two greatest players of all time, one could certainly argue, but with the likes of Inaki Williams and the Ayew brothers, Ghana are actually pretty well equipped in attacking areas at this World Cup. Outside of Thomas Partey though, they could certainly do with some strengthening in midfield, and who better to provide that than Michael Essien. Given that we are talking about bringing a player back at their very peak, Essien's peak was honestly probably second only to Yaya Touré's in terms of African midfielders during my lifetime. A tough tackling, industrious, and wonder goal scoring box-to-box sensation, Essien would transform this Ghana team, and his inclusion seemed like a no-brainer to me. Iran. Karim Bagheri. Ali Daei is widely regarded as being Iran's GOAT, given the 109 goals that he scored from 149 caps for the country's national team, followed by Ali Parvin, but centre forward is Iran's strongest position, thanks to Sardar Azmoun, and Carlos Queiroz doesn't play with the number 10. In fact, you can probably expect him to play with a back 10 at this World Cup, with Azmoun up front on his own. For that reason, I chose to bring back Karim Bagheri, who didn't do much during his brief spell at Charlton Athletic, but is still one of Iran's greatest ever players. A defensive midfielder, he would fit like a glove into this current Iran team, yet he still managed to score 50 goals from 87 caps for the national team, so he seems like the best of both worlds to me. Japan. Hidetoshi Nakata. I think Japan's biggest weaknesses are in defence and up front, where Celtic striker Daisen Maeda may well get the nod, despite only having scored one goal from 8 caps for Japan to date. I considered both Kazu Yoshimura, who is incredibly still playing professionally at the grand old age of 55, and arguably Japan's greatest ever centre-forward, Kunoshiji Kamamoto, but ultimately, I think the gulf between Hidetoshi Nakata and arguably also Shunsuke Nakamura at their respective peaks, and every other former Japanese international is far too great for them to be overlooked. Nakata is the obvious choice, the greatest Japanese footballer of all time in his prime, and I suppose he would have to take the place of either Endo or Morita in midfield. Mexico. Hugo Sanchez. This might have been a difficult one a little while ago, when Raul Jimenez was at the peak of his powers for Wolves playing in the Premier League, but he has struggled ever since sustaining that awful skull fracture, for understandable reasons, and there's every chance that Club America forward Henry Martin will start ahead of him at the World Cup. Martin is a clever, industrious and athletic frontman, but Hugo Sanchez is by far the greatest Mexican footballer to have ever lived, so this was a very easy decision. Sanchez was a sensation for both of the big two in Madrid, Atletico and Real, and he was so good and so explosive that his return could probably even put an end to Mexico's round of 16 curse. Morocco. Mohamed Tamoumi. I would love to pick either Razaki Baudu or Noureddine Naibet for Morocco, who are undoubtedly the country's finest goalkeeper and centre-back, but they are also two of Morocco's strongest positions heading into this World Cup. I actually really like the balance of Morocco's probable starting 11 in Qatar, and their weak link, I suppose, might be Angers youngster Azzedine Unai in midfield. Mohamed Tamoumi was an attacking midfielder, rather than a number 8, but he was also the last African to win the African Footballer of the Year award while still playing in Africa. He is the greatest Moroccan midfielder prior to their current generation, and I think that he is probably my best bet here. The Netherlands. Johan Cruyff. It is near enough impossible to pick anyone other than Johan Cruyff for the Netherlands. I nearly picked Marco van Basten because the Dutch are a little lacking in the striker department at this tournament, which is unusual for them, but even as a centre-forward, Cruyff would probably be a better option than Van Basten, I think, which is a pretty remarkable claim to make given that Van Basten is quite literally one of the greatest and most complete centre-forwards ever to have played the game. Cruyff was averaging a goal a game during his teens though, and found football so easy that he had to pioneer a new approach to the game, alongside Rinus Michels at Ajax, before he'd even hung up his boots. He was a genius, and he would utterly transform what is already a very decent Netherlands team. Poland. Zbigniew Boniek. Poland's two greatest players of all time, along with Robert Lewandowski, were both predominantly attacking midfielders, namely Zbigniew Boniek and Kazimierz Dyna, and that is convenient for me given that there is certainly room for improvement in that position in this current Poland team, whether that be ahead of Sebastian Szymanski or Christian Bielik. Both creative, endlessly skillful, and versatile midfielders, you can take your pick between Boniek and Dyna. I went with Boniek, who Diego Maradona once described as being the best counter-attacking footballer in the world, and he could certainly take some of that goal-scoring burden off Robert Lewandowski for Poland. Portugal. Eusebio. My go-to answer for Portugal at previous tournaments, at least if I remember rightly, has been Mario Coluna, who I think is one of the greatest midfielders ever to have played the game, and he would therefore still be an enormous addition to this current Portugal team, possibly taking the place of William Carvalho. Now that Cristiano Ronaldo is 37 years old though, is in fairly poor form, and has spent more 90 minutes talking to Piers Morgan than he has actually playing football this season, and even looks to be a bit of a drag on an otherwise exciting Portugal team, I'm afraid that I think replacing him with Eusebio would now be my best bet. Eusebio was an absolute freak of nature, as fast as an Olympic sprinter, outstanding on the ball, and ruthless in front of goal. He bagged 46 goals in 28 games in his most prolific season at Benfica, which is an absurd record, a couple of years before winning the Ballon d'Or, as well as scoring 41 goals from 64 caps for Portugal. Put him up front in this current Portugal team, at his peak, and I would make them the tournament favourites. Qatar. Mansour Mufta. Qatar is a country with very little football heritage or tradition, and prior to winning, or buying the right to host this World Cup, they haven't really had any great footballers. Mansour Mufta is the obvious choice, tied with current Qatar star Almoez Ali as the country's all-time leading goal scorer on 42 goals, and having been the top scorer in the Qatar Stars League on 7 separate occasions. He was probably rubbish. I could only find one clip of him scoring a header, and he is probably the only player in this entire video that wouldn't make his country's current starting 11. Saudi Arabia. Majed Abdullah. It is boring, but it is nonetheless the right answer. Saudi Arabia were rubbish at the 2018 World Cup, really honestly just terrible, and whilst I expect them to be a little bit better under the management of Hervé Renard and playing so close to home in neighbouring Qatar at this World Cup, they could still improve on an individual level in every single position. For that reason, it makes sense just to pick the greatest Saudi footballer, and indeed the greatest Western Asian footballer of all time, in the form of Majed Abdullah, who was a brilliant all-round centre-forward who scored 72 goals from 117 caps for the Saudi national team. He would take the place of Firas Al-Bakairan, who is widely expected to start for Saudi Arabia at the World Cup, and he would be a major upgrade. Senegal. El Hadji Diouf. Senegal went as far as any African nation ever has in their World Cup debut in 2002, but this is the best crop of players that the country has ever had, as was illustrated by their first AFCON crown in 2021. That might be somewhat undermined by an injury to Sadio Mane, who has been included in the Senegal squad for this World Cup as the country's talisman, but is widely expected to still be injured. Senegal look relatively strong in both defence and in midfield, and assuming that Mane is fit, I would start El Hadji through the middle for Senegal, where they do seem to be a little bit more lacking in talent, which is where he also played some great games at the 2002 World Cup. Senegal's charismatic star man 20 years ago, before courting controversy, shall we say in England, Diouf is still adored in his homeland. Serbia, Dragan Djalic. It's really difficult with Serbia, who have a well-balanced team heading into the 2022 World Cup, but play a 3-5-2 formation. That is a problem because Serbia's greatest player of all time, and indeed the greatest Yugoslavian player of all time, Dragan Djalic, played on the left wing. Filip Kostic will start at left wing back for Serbia at the World Cup, where he will be one of their star men, so you can't drop him. Ultimately, Djalic was just too good to overlook though, so I would take him and either play him up front, where there are fitness concerns surrounding both Dusan Vlahovic and Alexander Mitrovic heading into this tournament, or just in a free role behind one of those two. South Korea, Chubumkan. South Korea look to have some real talent in midfield and on the flanks going into this World Cup, but it is in both boxes that football matches are won and lost, and that is where they are most in need of improvement. For that reason, it was a toss-up between Chubumkan and Hong Myung-bo, but goals win games, so I've gone with the Bundesliga legend. Chubumkan changed the face of Korean football and the perception of Asian footballers more broadly worldwide after enjoying enormous success at both Eintracht Frankfurt and Bayer Leverkusen, and he would inject some much-needed firepower into this current South Korea team. Spain, Telmo Zarra. I don't think that it is any great secret that Spain lack a world-class centre-forward. Alvaro Morata actually has a very respectable international goal-scoring record, and I think he's capable of enjoying a really good World Cup. But if Spain had an absolute monster up front, they could be capable of going all the way at this World Cup. For just that reason, I went with Telmo Zarra, a man who scored 335 goals in 354 games for Athletic Bilbao, and bagged 20 goals in 20 games for Spain. A genius in terms of his movement, Zarra came alive within the 6-yard box, he possessed a lethal finish with either foot, and he was deadly in the air. A real no-brainer then. Switzerland, Josef Hugi. For the last two major tournaments, I have said that Haris Seferovic was Switzerland's weak link up front, and I have picked legendary Swiss striker Andre Aberglen to replace him as a result. Seferovic proved me badly wrong at Euro 2020, but he is without a goal in 8 league appearances for Galatasaray so far this season, so I'm afraid that I am pinpointing him as Switzerland's weak point yet again. Just to keep things interesting though, instead of Aberglen, I have gone with Basel legend Josef Hugi, who scored 22 goals in 34 games for Switzerland, including 6 at the 1954 World Cup alone, where he was only outscored by Hungarian legend Sandor Kocsis. Tunisia, Tarak Diab. I don't think Tunisia are an especially good team, and I was slightly surprised that they beat Mali to qualify for the World Cup. Admittedly well organised, on an individual level, you could make improvements anywhere on the pitch. Hence why I've gone with Tunisia's GOAT, none other than Tarak Diab, who starred for Tunisia when they won their first World Cup game against Mexico in 1978. And they would have to wait until 2018, when they played against Panama, for their second World Cup win. Diab was a gifted and graceful attacking midfielder, renowned for his technique and passing, and there is no doubt that he would start in his prime in this current Tunisia team. The United States, Billy Gonçalves. Make no mistake, this current crop of players is the best that the USMNT has ever had, and their lack of historical football pedigree makes this quite a difficult one. I've gone all the way back to Billy Gonçalves, a man who was nicknamed the Babe Ruth of soccer and is arguably the greatest American soccer player of all time, as my choice for the Stars and Stripes. The son of Portuguese immigrants to Massachusetts, Gonçalves could play anywhere from centre-half to inside forward, so I would probably try and shoehorn him in at centre-back, which I think is a potential weak spot for the USMNT, who may well start an all-MLS pairing there in Qatar, unless Tim Ream does get the nod. Uruguay. Juan Alberto Schiaffino. It's really difficult with Uruguay, who have such a vast array of former greats, and a few positions that could quite comfortably be upgraded. I think Jose Andrade is the obvious choice, but Uruguay are actually really well equipped in central midfield, with Federico Valverde and Rodrigo Bentancur. Hence why I've picked Juan Alberto Schiaffino. The former Penarol and AC Milan legend was Uruguay's talisman as they won the 1950 World Cup, playing in attacking midfield, and he is the perfect choice to link up Uruguay's impressive midfield and attack. Wales. John Charles. I didn't even have to think about this one, not even for a split second. Not only is John Charles the greatest Welsh footballer of all time, he could literally play anywhere on the pitch, so whatever you think might be Wales's weakness going into this World Cup, the gentle giant is the solution. Charles was, at one time, arguably the best centre-back and centre-forward on the planet, simultaneously, which I think are probably the two weakest positions in this Wales squad. I'd start him up front personally, where he would increase Rob Page's side's goal threat by a magnitude of about 20 as a replacement for Brennan Johnson. And good luck defending balls into the box in the last 10 minutes against Wales once they bring on Kiefer Moore to play alongside him. So that is it for today's video, a long one, but hopefully an enjoyable one. I find these quite fun, so hit the like button if that was the case, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for HITC Sevens. Oh, and you can also find me on Twitter or on Instagram via the username @HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.